RC from the Mountaintop Joiner Shop here. Welcome to the second installment of what I call my opposite of a 1-minute dovetail series. You see, in the first installment, what I thought I was doing was a build series in which I build this kind of side table slash prep table thing that attaches to my travel trailer. And what it ended up being instead was more of a treatment of through dovetails, and a quite exhaustive one at that. So what I'm gonna be doing in this video is continuing that build, and in that build I end up doing a bunch of dovetail sockets, the kind in which you're inserting a drawer divider into a case, and those dovetails help hold the divider in place as well as hold the whole case together and stiffen the whole structure up. And I think that's a good skill to learn because it is half-plane dovetail adjacent. There's a lot of overlap in the skills required to do both of those things. So I'm going to continue this series by continuing that build and then talking about those dovetail sockets in this video. So I hope you'll join me for that, and yeah, let's get going. Okay, so I got that pin board about ready to go as far as the dovetails are concerned. There's some other joinery that's going to have to happen here. But here's what I'm thinking is going to happen next. So this is the underside of the top. This end is going to attach to the trailer. And at this end, I want a little bit of an overhang for reasons that will be clear a little bit later on, which means I need to mark on this top where the ends of this drawer box are going to terminate. So I'm measuring from the end to about 98 centimeters here. I'm gonna put a little tick mark right at the edge, right about there. That's 98 centimeters right there. What I'm gonna do is drop my marking knife right into that little divot I put in there, line this up with the sides, and slide this over until it hits it. So I'm right at 98. And now I'm gonna mark the opposite end. So now I know where the outer ends of this drawer box are going to be on the underside of my top. What I'm going to end up doing is taking my ends, I'm going to put dados across here, and at the leading edge of each dado I'm going to put a dovetail. So that's going to attach the front edge of the sides to the top at both ends of the drawer box, like so. Later on I'm going to put a divider in here so I can have two drawers. So I'm going to have to do dados for both of these and that center divider on both on the top here, and then that center divider is also going to have a corresponding dado on the inside of my pin board, and that's going to have dovetails at the top and the bottom here at the leading edge of the drawer box. This is the front over here. So I hope that all makes sense. So what I'm going to end up doing is a totally different kind of dovetail from a through dovetail like this. It's going to be a dovetail socket at the front edge of the drawer box. That'll help hold the drawer box to the top at the front edge. At the back edge, I'm going to be putting a plywood back on here, and that back is going to help hold the drawer box to the top on that back side of the drawer box. So I hope that all makes sense. That's what's yet to come. I got a bunch of measuring to do to know where to put those dados. And then those dados will help me align my dovetails to the leading edge so I can mark my tails onto the top, and that's where I'll know to put my dovetail sockets in. So in order to know where the locations of my dados on the underside of that top are going to be, it's necessary for me to mark the stub tenons that correspond with those dados on the sides. And then I can measure from the edge of that stub tenon to the outer edge of the side, and that will allow me to then transfer that distance to those outer edges on the underside of the top that I showed you just a moment ago. So my weapon of choice for doing that is this contraption here. This is an MT center gauge from Woodpecker's Tools. I don't have a lot of Woodpecker's tools. They're quite expensive, and a lot of them are kind of gimmicky, but this thing has just been freaking awesome for me. So what it is basically a parallelogram kind of deal where you can attach different width bars to these little thumb screws right here. So right now I have a 1/4 inch bar in there, which is the size dado I'm going to be applying here. But you can get other bars in different widths, like this one's a 3/8. This is back when I still worked in imperial units, so all of mine are imperial, but they do a metric version as well, or at least they used to. I haven't really checked in a very long time. Maybe this is still a thing, maybe it isn't, but I absolutely love this thing for marking out stuff like tenons, or in this case, a stub tenon. So what I'm gonna do is center it on the edge of the board here, and mark an inner and an outer edge of my stub tenon. Those two lines are going to end up being exactly a 1/4 inch apart. And now I can come in here and measure how far that is from the edge of my board. And it looks to be about 4.5 mil. So I'm going to do my best to transfer exactly that distance to the underside of that top. Now it'll tell me where to route my dados in the underside of that top. And of course, this will also tell me where the stub tenon is going to be on both of the sides. So I'm going to align a wheel gauge to that, like so. Tighten that guy down, double check that it fits in there nice. And now I can go ahead and mark that. It should be the same on both sides, and it is, thank goodness. So I'm going to go ahead and finish marking out these things, and I'll show you my preferred method for cutting the dados on the underside of that top. So this here is the way I like to cut my dados these days. I used to cut all of my dados by hand, and that gets to be a little bit tedious after a while. The accuracy I'm able to get with this is second to none. It's certainly much easier and less time consuming to do the cuts. So while the router is easily one of my least favorite of all the power tools, I am starting to change my tune in that regard because this setup is the bee's knees. For one thing, one of the things I've always hated about routers is the incredible, like, just tornado of dust that it would kick up. But these Festool tools, one of the best things about them is the dust collection. That produces very little, and my shop vac has a HEPA filter in it, so I'm not breathing in a bunch of dust that's liable to give me cancer. So what I ended up starting with was a track saw. I got that to do all the flooring in our house with a track saw and this MFT, the multifunction table is what they call that. And of course, Festool makes all kinds of other things that go along with this existing infrastructure, like this doodad here that the router came with, that allows me to mount the router to the same track saw track and use the router instead of the track saw on that track. So this is the OF1010. This is their mid-sized router. It's just I believe a step up from like a trim router, but not their big super high horsepower one. And that's good enough for me for how often I use it and the kinds of things I use it for, which is the kind of small scale joinery like this. So this is my setup. I have it adjusted on these rails to get to the mark that I put on the board, and I'll put up on screen the mark. So it's just a little knife line with a little tick mark to denote which side of that knife line I'm supposed to be putting the dado on. So I got that adjusted so the bit in here just kisses the right side of that knife line. It is a 1/4 inch spiral upcut bit. I have a little foot here on the outside that allows me to support this kind of end that's hanging way out here so the router doesn't tilt off of the track and cut a little bit of a crooked dado. And I just have enough purchase here, just barely, to put this dado where I want it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and fire this up, put a through dado here, and I have several other ones that I need to do that I will show you once it's all routed out. By the way, I'm actually entering a dado from the front side of the case, which is not only my reference edge, but going to be the show face when this whole thing is done, because it's less likely to blow out any kind of chips or splintering or anything like that. It will do that at the back end as it exits the cut. If you want to avoid that at both ends, what you do is enter from one side and then enter from the other side and kind of meet in the middle. But in my case, all this material back here is going to get removed, so if anything blows out, it's not a big deal. That's going to just disappear later. So I'm cutting in from the show face on all these dados here. So I've cut all my dados except one, and that one that I haven't cut yet is going to be the center dado on the underside of the top. And the reason I haven't cut that yet is because I haven't marked it yet. And the reason I haven't marked it yet is because I don't want to really rely on measuring to get this in the right spot to match the one on the other panel. What I'd rather do is cut the dado in the other panel and then align those two pieces with each other, like so. And I have my knife marks still on the board from earlier. And now I can mark the location of the dado that's going to go on the top directly from the other side, the opposing workpiece. Put a little knife line on each side of this. If I center my router bit on that, I should be sitting pretty, and those things should line up almost perfectly when I put the whole case together. So all those dados are cut now, and it's time to mark out not only the stub tenons, but the dovetails are going to be on the leading edge of my side pieces. So what I ended up doing is measuring the thickness of the top, because I don't want these dovetails to be a through dovetail. I want the top to be nice and contiguous. So there's going to be a dovetail socket there that is necessarily shorter than the overall thickness of the top. So the thickness of the top is 18 mil or so. So I made my dovetails to be about 15. I want to leave about 3 mil of some meat there on the top of the dovetail. So measured down 15, and with my marking gauge, I put a mark all the way around the side, the back, and then along the other side. But I stopped short of marking all the way across the front because I put a little dovetail there. So let me show you, maybe you can see this a little bit better. So I marked a dovetail on the end here, if I can get it in focus. And that dovetail is actually a 14 degrees. So I use my 14-degree saddle marker and just marked that with a pencil, because it's not super critical that it's 14 degrees exactly, but I want to have some kind of guideline on there so that when I remove this waist, it looks nice and even. I got my dovetail marked on the end there, and I have a baseline around both sides. So then I had to mark out where the stub tenon is going to go. So I measured the depth of my dado, and that is about 1/4 inch or so. And I marked just shy of that distance from the baseline up with a marking knife. Just put a little tick mark, and then I matched up a marking gauge to that tick mark to set the marking gauge correctly. And then I ran that all the way around from behind the tail all the way around the back to the other side where it meets up to the back of the tail again. So I have a tail here that is about 20 mil deep. And the reason I chose 20 mil is because I generally like these dovetail sockets to be equal to, or maybe just a little bit deeper than the thickness of the top to which that dovetail is attached. So that's kind of why I chose that distance. So now I have that all marked out, and let's see, I traced on the back here what that stub tenon is going to look like. So you can see that I have a bunch of material above that stub tenon to remove here. What I'm going to do to remove that is use the bandsaw to get the bulk of that waste off. Of course, you could use a handsaw as well. And then as far as doing the actual stub tenon, removing the waste on either side of that stub tenon, this is too tricky to really do with the router over there and the MFT, and I don't have a router table. So I'm going to be removing all that by hand. So I'll show you how to do that. And then the last thing I will do is cut the waste out to create the dovetails at the ends there. That I'm going to do with a chisel, actually, because these dovetails match right up to the very corner of the edge there. Good luck getting a saw started in that spot. I'm going to end up just paring away this material with the chisel, so I'll show you how I do that as well. So fun fact, if you have this much short grain, which is very little, you don't need to get a saw out to remove this little piece of waste at all. You just stick a chisel in there. I have a knife line marked, which is to mark the back side of my dovetail. So I'll just put a chisel straight down on that and give it a little tap. And there is a super clean cut right behind my dovetail there where I've removed this waste. All right, so we knocked off that strip of waste material, and on top here I no longer have my mark. You can see on top of the tail there, but you can't see it on top of here. So it's a good thing that I didn't change the setting on this wheel gauge. That matches what I marked earlier, so I can reestablish those lines, and that'll be my guide for knowing where to stop cutting when I create this stub tenon that's going to be behind the tail here. I'll reestablish these. I'm going to grab a chisel. That's mostly what I'm going to be using to remove this waste. And we'll create our stub tenon behind the tails on both of these pieces. Okay, so now what I want to do is put a stub tenon behind this dovetail like this. So hopefully you can see that okay. It's kind of hard to get in frame. But I have my other workpiece here, and I'm just going to mobilize it against a planing stop. The edge of my bench is right here. So it's just inside the edge of my bench, and I'm just going to get this immobilized right here. So if you're trying to do a stub tenon like this, one of the ways you could do that, of course, is with a router table, but I don't have a router table, so that kind of precludes that. But even when I had a router table, I found that it's pretty finicky to set up. If I mess my setup even a tiny bit, then I could potentially ruin this entire workpiece that I've already cut dovetails on the other side of. So I'm going to do it the slow way that I'm less likely to screw it up. So I'm going to do it with just a regular chisel. So I have a couple chisels here. My wider chisels I've kind of touched up the blades on. In fact, I kind of need to do this one again. What I'm going to do is deepen this knife line and then remove some of the material, basically deepen the knife wall until I get deep enough that I can cut from the edge of the board here. So I'm going to be cutting downward into the knife line to establish a deeper knife line and then cut in this way. What I'm going to do that with is a paring chisel. So I have this long crank neck paring chisel here. I find it's much easier to control it, and of course the bevel angle is a little bit less difficult to push through the wood because this is a 25-degree sharpening angle, whereas all my regular bench chisels are at 30 degrees. So first things first, I'm going to deepen those knife lines. Just like that. And so yeah, this is probably ultimately a good bit slower than doing it with a router table. You saw that router setup that I cut my dados with. That's great for cutting dados, but I think this would be really finicky to try to mount this small workpiece to my multifunction table in a way that I could cut that accurately. And this is the way I've kind of always done it. After I got rid of my router table I had many years ago, I had started doing it this way, and now that's what I'm kind of used to. And it's been quite some time since I've done one this way, but you know how it is. You get used to doing something a certain way, that just kind of becomes your go-to. So now I'm going to deepen the knife line with the chisel. Now that there's enough material here that when I hit the chisel, the bevel of the chisel doesn't just push the chisel and move my baseline back. I'm hitting with just kind of a medium force here. And I'm standing to the side, so I'm actually standing over that way and eyeballing down the line that I am deepening so I can see that I'm holding my chisel more or less vertical. And if you're doing this kind of thing, I like to err on the side of cutting in, basically undercutting that baseline rather than having to pare it away more later. But if I have to pare a little bit away later, that's also not that big a deal. Oops, I didn't really hit that one hard enough. And then I'm going to stop. I guess I could keep going and start working on that tail ahead of time, but I'm just going to do this little stopped rabbit right now. So now I can come back in with my paring chisel and take a little bit more material off. So you can see my first cut was like here. And now I'm working from back here, removing more of the material that way. And you just kind of get into a little bit of a rhythm. A little more. I think I'm going to do one more pass that same way. So I'm going to deepen that knife line some more. And this time I'm hitting the chisel just a little bit harder. So this will be my last pass where I'm starting from the top surface and cutting downward into that baseline. So I'm right out here by this outer corner now. And the reason I'm doing it that way is if I just start cutting from the outside edge into this baseline when it's really shallow cut, I run the risk of just blowing right through it and wrecking the thing. So I'm cutting downwards to start until I have a nice deep knife line or baseline, and then once that's nice and deep, I can then start taking cuts from the outside with a lot less risk. There we go, and I'm stopping right behind my dovetail over here. All right, now I'm ready to go deeper. Now there's a lot of material backing up the back side of the chisel here, so I can hit it good and hard and start taking deeper chopping cuts. and spots I didn't hit deep enough, I'll go back and address again. Now I can take a cut from the outside edge of the workpiece now. And this is where things start to speed up. Now I'm taking much more material off with each of these little pairing cuts. And the surface you're cutting along here might start to get a little uneven as you do this. It's not a big deal. Just be aware that there is a baseline on this side that I have to avoid overcutting, of course. You can see I'm using my previous cut here to establish the next cut. That sometimes allows me to remove a thicker piece with less force. And I'll just lever that out of the corner. Now I'm to the point where I can just wail on this thing. I find I have a little bit more control if I hit the chisel a couple times instead of one time really hard. There's just a little bit more control that way. All right, now I'm back to this edge again, removing a pretty decent sized chunk of waste. Something somewhere likes to rattle when I'm doing this. I don't know if you can hear that. But with all the tools and things I have on my workbench, that's liable to happen. I bet I know what it is. It's my sliding dead man. Oh, all of a sudden it's quiet. A little bit easier to concentrate when I don't have some random noise in my ear bothering me. All right, so I think I have one more pass to do like I just did before I'm right close to the baseline. And then we'll do that final pass at the baseline. Now I prefer to do this with a paring chisel instead of taking my bench chisel down here and tapping the waste loose, because when I do that, I end up cutting a little bit deeper than I probably should for establishing my baseline. And then you end up with material that's kind of sticking up like this a lot more often. And that material sticking up can get in the way of deepening your baseline a little bit. So I like to flatten it out and then come through with the bench chisel on top again. If this material kind of sticking out here ends up between the chisel and the baseline, it tends to push your baseline out. Then you have to come back and pare away some of that extra material later if you're looking for a really, really tight fit. In this case, it doesn't need to be airtight to my mind, but of course, this joinery does serve a purpose, and I hope to illustrate what that purpose is later on once I have all these done. All right, so now I'm going to take a pass right above the baseline, which means the pass after this one, I'll be dropping the tip of my paring chisel directly into that baseline, and that'll be the final pass. Well, here I'm already practically on top of it. All right, final pass of the chopping chisel in the top. All right, so this time I'm going to cut by putting the tip of the chisel directly into that knife line that I made with the wheel gauge earlier. I'm going to use the fact that this bench is sticking out right here to watch if I'm parallel to the bench. Okay, so you can probably just barely see that knife line there, if at all, but it's there. And I'm going to be paring away to my final marking line here by dropping the tip of the chisel directly into that line. And now I can watch the surface of my bench and my paring chisel to see if the two are in parallel with each other. And I'll just wiggle it like this until I've hit the baseline. Pretty deep cut that time. I can feel that the chisel is in that line, check for parallel, and work my way in by rotating the chisel on kind of this, what would you call that, transverse plane. Now, if the grain is working in such a way that it's like this, it's sloping upward, then your chisel is likely to travel upward along with it. So I might have to come back here and actually pare away some of that extra material after the fact, but for right now I'm just trying to establish that baseline. Conversely, there will be times when the grain is running downward, in which case you're basically going to be undercutting the joint a little bit, but that's not the end of the world because I'm not relying on this joint to be a glue joint so much. A stub tenon in a dado like that, everything in that joint is end grain to long grain, and as such isn't particularly strong from a glue bond perspective, but but it does serve a purpose, and that's why I'm going to all the trouble to do this. Okay. Now I have a bunch of schmutz there, for lack of a better term. I can come down here with a marking knife, just drag it along there. So I don't want a line so deep that I'm like undercutting my stub tenon. So in doing this a couple times, I should be able to separate all that little bit of waste from there. There we go, pretty clean. Now I can eyeball down the length of this from way over there and see, I can kind of get my eyeballs level with the baseline and see and feel if there are any high spots. And there are definitely a few high spots here that need addressing. There's one right here. Let's get that off of there. There's another one right there. What the ultimate test will be if this stub tenon actually fits into the dado that I created with the router earlier on. So I'm going to test fit it and adjust accordingly. But that is a stopped rabbet on one side. Now I need to flip the workpiece over and do it on the other side. And I think I'm going to time it to see how long that takes me, just as an FYI. Not that I'm particularly fast at this, because it's been a while since I've done it. If you're the kind of person, say you got buckles on your shoes, you're in 1790 and you're a professional cabinet maker, probably knock this kind of thing out in a hurry. But I don't do this every day. I'm very much a part-timer. So it does take me some time to do it. Just to give you a sense of how much it'll take, I think you'll be relieved to know it's not an all-day project to create these stub tenons. Okay, so I timed that last one. It took me about, 3 seconds shy of 15 minutes or so. And actually I had to stop for a second and touch up the blade on my paring chisel along the way. And now I have 2 stub tenons ready to go on these dividers. Now that last one, because I was kind of pushing things along a little bit, came out a little bit ugly. That's kind of the risk inherent in kind of pushing things along and rushing, whereas normally I just take my sweet time. But yeah, to do all of these stopped rabbets to create these 2 stub tenons would take you about an hour in all likelihood, depending upon how you do it. And it occurred to me while I was doing this that there's other ways that I could have established this baseline here other than chopping down on it with a chisel and a mallet. One of which is to deepen that knife line a little bit and then run a saw down the baseline and create a kerf here. The reason I didn't do that is this dovetail here on the end. I don't want to risk overcutting the baseline on that dovetail. I would have to use something like a stair saw. I guess I could use a carcass saw as well, but in the past when I've tried to cut kerfs that were this long, I've had the saw plate kind of jump out of the kerf before and then mess up, the show face. There's only a show face on one side of each of these, but that said, I just don't want to run the risk. So it's easier to just do it with chisels for me. So what I'm going to do next is cut these dovetails by paring them down with a chisel. And that part's always kind of fun to do. And once I've got that done, I'm going to test the fit of these stub tenons in the dados that I cut earlier and trim them if need be. I will make sure that they fit okay. And then I'll be in a position in which to transfer these dovetails to the outside edges of the panel that this is going to mount to. So that's all coming up next. Let's cut these dovetails, huh? All right, so this kind of dovetail is a different kind of dovetail. So you saw me cut through dovetails earlier, and of course you would cut your tails with a saw. But in this case, I don't really want to use a saw because I want this tail to be as wide as I can make it strong, which means that the corner of the tail is basically the corner of the stock that I'm cutting it from. And it makes it such that I can't really get the saw teeth to start right on this corner. That is well nigh impossible. So what I'm going to do instead of using a saw is use a chisel. And let me show you how I do that. Okay, so I'm all set up for this operation by putting it on the bench again and clamping it down. And I got out 2 chisels, both of which are wider than the tail that I'm cutting. So this is one of the reasons I cut a tail that's about, this one's about 20 mil. It's basically the same as the thickness of the top to which it's going to be attached. That is big enough to give strength, but narrow enough that I can pare away this material with a regular kind of wide chisel. So this is an inch wide chisel. And of course I have a paring chisel ready to go here as well. Let's go ahead and do this. So all of that business of cutting out this stub tenon with the chisels is good practice for getting ready to do these because it's basically the exact same principles. I'm going to pare away some of the waste to the baseline with the paring chisel from this side, like that. And then I'm going to deepen that knife line with the bench chisel, chop, chop, and take a little bit more off. and rinse and repeat. This time I can hit a little bit harder. I can move back further from the baseline and take off another slice. And I'm keeping an eye on that marking knife line that I've traced in with my mechanical pencil to just kind of see what my progress is until I'm close to my layout lines. So moving back a little bit again. And one of the things I'm doing is keeping an eye on the flat that's still left here to make sure that I'm coming in straight into the dovetail instead of coming in at a weird angle. Okay, hope that makes sense. I got enough to back up the chisel now that I can hit it pretty hard. There's my kind of bevel, and I'm gonna move back again from that, take a little bit longer shaving. And you can't see it, but I'm anchoring the butt end of this paring chisel kind of against my stomach and basically pushing with my legs to take those thick shavings like that. Now I'm getting closer to this corner. Still looking pretty good. This surface that it leaves behind is silky, silky smooth. It'll certainly make for a good glue joint. And I mean, it'd be ready for finish if I wanted to put finish on it, which I'm not, of course, not gonna do. Now I'm getting close to that marking knife line on the end there. So my next cut is gonna be at or right close to that corner there. It's an easy cut, but I don't think that angle is, well, I'm pretty much parallel to that line. I'm very close to it. All right, now I'm working right directly from the corner, as close as I can, angling down a little bit. I am pretty much right on that line. I'm gonna try to basically split it in half. Maybe I can take one more pass and get away with it. See if I can. This time I'm not cutting very deep. See if I can get right on that corner. That's nice and sharp right there. I overcut the line just a little bit. That's not a big deal to me. So instead of 14 degrees, it's like 15 or something. I'm looking to see how flat this is. Looks nice and flat. That's a pretty good looking tail right there. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that on the other side here to create my full tail. And then I'll be able to take this over to the mating workpiece and transfer my tails once these stub tenons are fit to their dados. All right, so stub tenon is cut. I have the dovetail cut, and now I'm gonna start messing with the fit of the stub tenon into the dado here. And the dados, because I use a spiral upcut bit, there's a bunch of fuzz here. I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's all kinds of fuzz sticking out of these little dados here. So what I'm gonna do is run a shoulder plane along those. Just a couple passes, just enough to kind of remove that fuzz. And that'll make it such that that's not the thing that's keeping this from fitting, right? So then I'll drop it in here and see how it goes. Okay, so there are multiple things wrong with the fit of this joint, and I'll go over them with you and tell you what I'm gonna do about it. So this fits pretty sloppy in here. For one, it doesn't fit all the way down to the shoulder, and the other problem is the stub tenon is too narrow, so there's some slop in here. And one of the whole reasons I'm doing this stub tenon is to keep this panel nice and flat across here, because this is going to be the side or the inside face of a drawer box. If this stub tenon fits loosely enough in here, it can allow the board to cup if it wants to, and then it'll affect the fit of the drawers. So we don't want that. And rather than, you know, wail and gnash my teeth and fret and throw things and utter some curse words, I think what I'm going to do instead is just fix it. This is the kind of thing that happens when we're working. Stuff goes awry. So before I tell you what I'm going to do to fix this, I'll tell you what I probably should have done to avoid this problem in the first place. What I think I should have done is make this stub tenon, when I measured it, slightly over wide. So intentionally make it such that it's a little bit too fat to fit in here. And then what I would do is go over both sides. So I'll do a light pass here to kind of keep the whole thing centered with a router plane, to trim it just a tiny bit at a time until it press fits down into that dado. So that's probably what I should have done. What I'm going to do to fix it, for one, this part where it doesn't quite fit down to the shoulder here, that's just a matter of the stub tenon being over long, as I said before. And the way I'm going to fix that is to run a router plane down this to take a tiny bit off the bottom of the dado until it does fit down to the shoulders. So that one's pretty easy. But what do I do about this stub tenon that's too narrow to fit in here? What I think I'm gonna do there is glue something onto this that is trimmable after the fact. Now, I don't really have any veneers laying around in my shop. I don't really want to try to cut some veneers to put in here. That's a lot of effort. So what I'm gonna do instead is take some brown paper bag. This is all wood fiber in here. And I'm gonna cut a strip of it, glue it to the side of one of these stub tenons, and then trim it flush. And that should make it fat enough that it doesn't really want to fit in there anymore. Once the glue is set, I'm going to trim away some of that and with a router plane, like I said before, to make it such that it's more of a press fit. So it doesn't much matter to me if this ends up being a strong glue joint or not. It just needs to keep this board flat. I wasn't really intending to glue this at all. I was just going to glue it at the front and then, put a case back on it that's going to support the back. That's what I'm going to do here. So while I'm waiting for the glue to dry on that repair, I checked the fit of the other stub tenon into the dado, and it's actually a little bit better. It's good enough to be acceptable in my opinion. So what I'm going to do now is move on to the next step, which is transferring my dovetails from that side panel to what is going to ultimately be the top of this little prep table. Now I have it clamped all the way back against the leading edge of the top such that my dovetail is flush to it. I messed around with the clamp until when I tighten the clamp, it tightens it to make sure that it is square. My shoulders look tight enough on both sides. So now that I have my square up to there, I can see that it's nice and 90 degree, and I'm not going to be transferring a crooked dovetail to this. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab a marking knife and sneak in here into these corners and transfer that to the leading edge of the board. That is going to be the top. And that'll be the beginnings of the dovetail sockets that are going to go in the top. And it's one of those things that I like to mark nice and deep, but also kind of take my time and make sure that I don't overcut. So I'm going to get underneath here and do this one. A little hard to see what I'm doing, but it appears to be working all right. All right, now when I take all this off of here, I should have the markings, beginnings of a dovetail socket there, and there it is. So I'm bringing it in closer so you can see that. Now, unfortunately for me, the base of the dovetail basically lines up with the corner where the dado comes out of the front there. And I really would have liked a little bit of a flat on that right side there. Going back to when I chose which slope to use for the dovetail, I chose a 14 degree. And I probably should have used the 1x6 instead to give myself a little bit of wiggle room. Right now, there's no place to really start my saw there. So that's on me. It's just, it's what happens when you take a little bit of time off. You kind of lose your flow and start making some bad decisions. But what I'm going to do now, as you can see, I got a wheel gauge set to the depth of the dovetail. And now I'm marking that depth on the workpiece. So it's pretty easy to see, but not something that will be visible once this panel is put into place, like that. And now I'm going to extend the left side, which does have a little bit of wiggle room on it, backward from there. So I'm going to take my little engineer square and my marking knife. I'm going to line my marking knife up with the dovetail, which is right there. Get up on top of it and slide to it, and go back from the wheel gauge mark all the way up front. So I have a nice square line right there. That one's also pretty hard to get to. So ordinarily what I would do is get out a carcass saw and saw these walls as far as I can. So I'll basically have an angled saw cut from that corner to that corner. I don't think I'm going to be able to balance the saw into there, so I might have to do this entire thing with chisels. And so that's kind of a recurring theme with this whole project, is just doing lots of chisel work. That just is what it is. If I can, I'm going to, if there's enough purchase here, I'm going to make that same line on this side here and then start chiseling this out. That's really all I can do at this point. That should get interesting. So obviously there's something to be said here about taking long breaks between doing projects that have a lot to them, that are kind of to a higher standard than a typical like carpentry project might be, because there's all kinds of little decisions you can see that I've made along the way that have resulted in headaches down the line. So if I was more in practice and had done projects more recently, I would perhaps remember some of those decisions that have kind of gone sideways on me in the past and not make them again in the future. Obviously, having some consistent practice without big breaks can help your projects along quite a bit as well. But it is what it is, and I've already got this project committed to, so I'm just going to keep on soldering through it, and hopefully there will be some teachable moments along the way regardless. Now that I've said all that, I think there might maybe just perhaps be just enough there for me to get a saw started on at least this side of the dovetail. And I really did want to show you how I'd normally do it, which is to saw out these walls at an angle. So I'm going to try to land my saw on this corner and get a kerf going. And if not, I'll just chisel it the rest of the way. But if I can pull this off, I can at least show you one of these walls kind of sawn out. So I'm going to throw my carcass saw in there and anchor it with my thumbnail. I am crouched down close to the ground now, so this whole thing is an awkward operation. I wish I could tell you there's some special secret to this. There isn't really. It's just a matter of sawing to the line. So far I'm doing okay. Yeah, I think I'm getting somewhere. It's okay if I overcut the line back here a little bit. That's not the end of the world. What I don't want to do is overcut this baseline down here. So I'm keeping an eye on that. Angling the saw down until I just give it a little smooch. That will save me a lot of effort of chiseling out at least this side of the dovetail socket going forward. So I'm glad that worked out, at least on that side. So starting out with this chiseling operation, at least, I got 2 chisels, just regular bench chisels. This one is a 3/4 inch chisel, which is slightly less than the 20 mil depth that this socket is. And the other one I'm using is this guy here. This one is a 1/4 inch bench chisel, which I'll be using at the back end of the socket, at least starting out. And then later on I'll break out a specialty chisel that I think is very, very useful for doing dovetail sockets like these. So the first thing I'm going to do is try to establish a little bit of a wall on the other side of this dovetail where I couldn't quite get my saw started. So I'm going to drop my chisel, not the full depth of this socket, but at least part way, just to give myself a little bit less resistance to deal with when I'm chopping down in here. I'm matching the angle of the chisel to the angle of the dovetail cut. And let's see if I can't get it started here. And then cutting down along the line, you can see that some of the material is starting to break free now. And as that happens, I want to reduce the resistance that I'm chopping against by removing some of that material. So a lot of these chiseling operations or techniques are ones that are just general. They're not really specific to doing this kind of dovetail socket. So if you learn these skills with chisels, you can apply them wherever it's necessary on any project for any operation. All right, now I'm kind of down to the bottom of this here. And now I want to extend that further back towards where the back end of the socket is. So I'm going to go back to about here. Extend that socket back a little bit. Pare away a little bit of the waste, and then chisel it out some more. And now I'm going to chop down at the back end, like that, to establish the back wall, so to speak. So I'm just slowly relieving the borders of this socket and removing the material that's inside of those borders. Hope that kind of makes sense. And of course I can't get a chisel down inside of the socket, so you can't really see everything I'm doing, but hopefully my descriptions will suffice. You can kind of guess what my next step is as I go along here. None of this is really rocket science, or rocket surgery as my wife likes to say. Now because I cut this curve at an angle, you can see that's rising up to the back of this socket. So I'm going to keep working on the back of the socket with my chisel. I've already established that back wall, and I'm going to come in here with this chisel. And again, I'm trying to match the angle of the curve. Now that's starting to come out. Now that I'm into the socket a little bit, I'm going to just keep digging down around the edges. The chisel, you can see I'm starting to angle this narrow chisel to match the angle of the dovetail to get into the back of there. Now that I've done that, I can start to pare away material from the front. There we go. The makings of a socket are starting to show now. Work away at the edges. Then pare away the waste in between those edges. Taking away a little chisel shaving. And as I get a little bit deeper, I'll show you the specialty chisel that I like to use to get way down into the bottoms of these corners here. But in the meantime, I'm just going to keep on doing what I'm doing here. Rinse and repeat. All right, now I got you way zoomed in here so you can hopefully see what I'm doing. I've moved to this slightly wider chisel from the 1/4 inch one. This one's a 3/8 inch. And you can see that I'm almost to the baseline at the bottom of the socket here. So what I'm going to do is try to split the difference here. Maybe take half of this material away with this pass. And then I'm going to carefully chop around the edges again, because I don't want to just wail on the chisel and have my chopping extend below that baseline so much. Got to be careful about that. But I'm going to go ahead and pare away some of this material. There's the line. Come on, just a little bit from there. And pare away some of that material. Get out of there, you little punk. I'm going to nibble around the edges. Definitely not going to be hitting as hard as I might ordinarily, so I don't extend below that baseline. But I still chop enough that it's pretty easy to remove that final shaving there. And it is right on there. Let's get in the back of there with the fishtail chisel. Again, just light taps. The fishtail chisel in particular, you can see is in line with the grain. So if I hit that hard enough, it can really split that out, potentially. So definitely want to steer clear of that. Now I'm right down into the baseline. I really can't remove more without going straight to it. So I'm going to try to find the baseline knife line with my chisel. Feels like it's right there. I'm going to go right down the middle this time. There we go. Now I'm going to come out to these corners. And I want nice clean corners down here, so I'm going to pare away from the walls a little bit too. But before I get too carried away chiseling away from those walls, let me show you another tool. No doubt you've seen this tool in my other videos. This is the Sterling Toolworks double square with the dovetail blade in it. And this thing is just fantastic for checking if you're square in sockets like this one. I can slide this down so it matches the depth of my socket, and I can hold it right up to the side of this and see how square I am, if there's any high spots that need removing, etc., etc., and remove any high spots. A lot of what I'm going to be doing here to trim this final little bit away from the sides of this is checking the fit with the actual workpiece itself. So let me grab that. So I'll go ahead and drop this in here and slide it back and see how close I am to this sliding in. It's pretty apparent to me that I definitely need to get closer to those knife lines on the sides here to allow that to happen. So I'm going to get over the top of this joint and pare down with my wider chisel and try to take out some material that way. Now I'm removing material that is essentially end grain here. So if you find that it's kind of difficult to get started, and this seems to be one of those cases, it's not the worst idea to take your chisel over to your sharpening bench and touch it up. When it's nice and sharp, you'll have an easier time cutting end grain like this. So I think I'm going to go ahead and do that. Yeah, because that does take just a bit much effort. So I'm going to go touch up this chisel and keep working at this, checking the fit until it just kind of wedges in there. And at that point I feel comfortable enough, assuming that the socket is square on the sides, that I can tap that joint all the way home with a mallet and everything will fit okay. Nothing will explode. That dovetail just barely starts to go in there. And sometimes it allows you to see where the tight spots are. Sometimes what you can do is look at the tail itself and see where the socket left marks on the tail, and that tells you what part of the socket needs more relief. In this case, it looks like this corner on the inside right here needs removing. So I'm going to try to get in there and pare it a little bit more. Now that I've gotten that little corner, test the fit again, make sure there's no schmutz in there. Sometimes I use other tools to try to fish pieces of waste out of there. Ooh, I am getting closer. Now it seems to me the tight spot is down in the bottom on both sides there. So I'm just going to try to pare the walls a little bit steeper. And before I do both sides, I'm going to just try one side and check the fit, because I want this to be a nice tight joint. So there with thumb pressure, I got it to go in a little bit. And part of my issue, it appears, I think there's a little bit of a high spot just inside the socket on that side, and I need to remove more material toward the back of this socket. It's actually tapering a little bit and in the wrong direction. So I'm going to come from this side and trim accordingly. How does that fit now? I like that. You know, if you can drive that dovetail partway home just with finger pressure, then you're well on your way. So I'll do one last check. The tail itself, see if there's any obvious marks there where things need to be relieved. Looks like top and bottom on this side. As long as it's not too tight, nothing should crack or explode or whatever. I think if I pound that home, it'll be pretty peachy and wicked strong. And here's the divider that I put that brown paper bag onto the stub tenon to thicken it up. And then I tested the fit again and it was still quite loose, so I ended up doing the same thing on the other side. So now it's got brown paper bag on both sides of the stub tenon. I don't know what went wrong there. It's kind of like one of those deals where you're walking around and you realize that you're bleeding somewhere and you have no idea what caused it. It's like, I don't remember having an accident. Nevertheless, chances are this is like a measuring and marking issue. There's an error in either how I set my marking gauge or how I measured to set that marking gauge to begin with. That's the issue when you do a project like this where you're just kind of making the whole thing up in your head, is you're more liable to run into situations where measuring and marking issues can cause problems. And of course, a measuring and marking issue this early in the project has a way of cascading throughout the entire project. So I'm probably in for more of that kind of things being just a little bit off and having to adjust accordingly. But at the same time, those tend to be teachable moments. So we're going to live with that. So you can see this whole thing is starting to take shape now. Here's the bottom. Got my sides, got my top. I got a drawer box taking place here. I'm taking shape. And I have one more divider that's going to go right in the middle here. And I'm going to dovetail socket just like these two into the top because I don't want to be able to see the top of the dovetail on this side. But on the bottom here, I don't much care about it being exposed. So I'm just going to do a through dovetail on this side. You know, make things a little bit easier to assemble as we go along. So that's where I'm going with this. I got one more piece here that's going to become a divider right in there. And then we're going to do a little bit of prepping for the glue up, which should be exciting because I have to glue these sides onto the bottom and then glue the sides into the top. I think I'm going to try to do all that in one go, which should be good fun. I'm going to go ahead and work on this divider and come back at you when it's time for the glue up. So earlier I showed you how my stub tenons that I did entirely with chisels turned out a little bit wonky, and that if I was going to do it again, I would do it with a router plane. So I'd establish a baseline with chisels like I did before, but then once the rabbet started to get established, I would finish that out with the router plane. And since I'm doing this divider, or the stub tenons on this divider, I figured this would be a good opportunity to show you. So if you're just starting out woodworking and all you got is the chisels, then the way I showed you earlier would be fine. However, having done one of these already with the router plane, I find this much more agreeable. I think I get a little bit better results using a little bit less force. There's a little bit, it's a kind of gentler method of doing this. So I've already got this baseline established, and I've already paired into it a little bit to leave a little bit of a kind of a hump here. So I'm going to start by removing that hump with the router plane, and you'll see because the router plane is hanging off the side of here, I'm putting all downward pressure on this side, and then from this side I'm not pushing down at all, I'm just pushing from the back to push it forward. One hand is holding it down and the other hand is pushing it forward. And I'm taking a way deeper cut than I probably should be, so I'm going to back off a little bit. Get the schmutz out of there so it doesn't leave marks on my workpiece. And there we go. Right down to the back of that dovetail. All right, now I'm going to advance my blade just a little bit, come a little bit closer to my baseline. Then I'm trying to get this started. You know, you got to be very careful these first few passes. You don't want to run the router plane into the keeper face of the workpiece. But what I'm going to do here, instead of chopping cuts with a chisel, now that I have this knife line nice and established and deep, pretty easy to just run a marking knife down that line to deepen it just a little bit. And that way, when you come back in with the router plane and remove that material, you're less likely to get kind of schmutz stuck in the corner there that doesn't quite lift entirely out. And now I'm running the side of my router plane blade right up against that wall, that knife wall. Now I'm getting a nice flat-bottomed, square to the face, stopped rabbet going here. And it's just a matter of rinse and repeat. Now, as this rabbet gets deeper, you got a little bit more of a wall to run the side of the blade against. You can maybe take a couple passes without having to run the marking knife down the knife line, but it's easy enough for me to just stop and grab it and advance a little bit. So I'm going to keep going like this, and when I get close to the knife line on the side there, I'm going to stop and then do the stopped rabbet on the other side down to my marking line. And then once I've gotten close, I'm going to stop and check the fit in the dado and remove just a tiny bit from both sides. So I'll take 2 passes every time, one off each side to keep that stub tenon centered, and then test the fit after each of those 2 passes until I get a nice press fit. And that, I think, is a better way to do this if you're doing it all by hand in lieu of something like a router table. Well, that's enough for this video, I think. It could have went a lot better, and it could have went a lot worse, and that's true for any project. But if you stuck with me throughout all of my misadventures with this project, given how rusty I've been, and that I've just forgotten certain things, like that I could cut stub tenons using a router plane instead of just having to chisel the whole thing, I much appreciate it, and I hope you still got something out of those kind of teachable moments that popped up in the course of this project. And I'll put up some footage of the finished prep table hooked up to the trailer. In the end, I used a hook and rail system instead of dowels to attach it to the shelf. And then I have a telescoping pole that fits under some U-brackets on the other end of it. And then I have the back of it fit behind the handle on the door, and once you set it up like that, it's nice and solid and it's great to work with. I ended up dovetailing the drawers. What can I say? I just can't help myself. Those stub tenons where the dovetail sockets were, somehow I managed not to record that. So my apologies for that, but I just kind of lined them up and just tapped them home with a soft blow mallet. And in the end, it all went together quite nicely. I hope you'll agree. That's it for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it, and we'll see you in the next one.